Great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks, Hannah, for inviting us to come along to run this workshop today. Just quickly to give you a bit of background into who I am. As Hannah said, I work in UCL in the Department for Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy. But my role there is quite unusual in the academic context. So I actually run a small team of sort of policy professionals, we like to think of ourselves. So our role is that we work with researchers across the engineering faculty at UCL to help them think about how they can engage with policymakers in order that their research can inform the policymaking process. So we work with lots of different teams on lots of different areas, and the expertise that we bring really is in thinking about how you do that engagement effectively, and we'll work with people to help them do that. And one of the things that we do is run trainings like this session today, so very pleased to come and offer it to this group today. Right, so to start with, I thought maybe we should kind of ask the obvious question, which is why engage with policy in the first place? I think there's lots of different reasons and motivations, but I'd be very interested to hear kind of your thoughts on this. Kind of why do it in the first place? Okay, well, I think we've covered most of the things I had on my list, but to change the world is top of my list. That's certainly what motivates me. But some other reasons. So for those of you who are at UCL, it is part of our mission to be an institution that has widespread influence and that changes the world and is engaged. So, that might be something to consider. Also, there is an increased desire, kind of certainly in the UK, in the government, to make greater use of evidence in the policy-making process, so to kind of meet that need. Coming back to some of the more pragmatic reasons, because the funders have said you've got to do it. I put pathways to impact, although that might not be for very much longer, but I think there is certainly an expectation from UK research and innovation that when you're writing a proposal, there will be consideration at that stage into impact of some regard. So that might be policy impact. So if you want to get your funding, you might have to think about impact. And then the final one, bottom of the list, that normally gets a groan, is REF, because we've got to say something in REF. So I think we've kind of picked up on most of those. Is there anything else that has sprung to mind, or anything that you disagree with? No? Okay, right. Well, let's move on then. And I did actually, one thing I did just want to mention, just kind of at the outset, is we've kind of organised a lot of the activities today and the kind of presentations around the UK policy system, because that's kind of what I'm familiar with, and obviously kind of it's easy being based in the UK, but I recognise that a lot of the projects here are much more international in their nature, and I hope that a lot of the principles that we'll be kind of going through today will apply in other contexts as well. So just to let you know about that. Hi, Robin. Hi. Do come and join us. Okay, so I wanted to start off by asking you to think about your hopes and fears about engaging with policy. So what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes, look at the images that are kind of spread out on your tables, and find one that kind of speaks to you around a hope that you have about policy engagement, and one that sort of reflects a fear that you might have. So if you could choose 2 images each, and then in the space, write down what your hope, what your fear is. So take about 5 minutes, and then we're going to share them with people on your table. Just to kind of set up what we're going to be doing today, Ina, who will be joining us shortly, and I like to think about policy engagement a bit like a good relationship. And I think the theme that we are going to be coming back to all throughout the day is it's really about the people and those relationships between the researchers and the policymakers. And that is really kind of the key. And I think as Linda was saying earlier, it's not just about research over here and policy making over here. It really is about that messy engagement and interaction between the people that makes it happen. So, knowledge generation, it's a social process, and that's kind of really what we want to emphasize today. So it is thinking about those relationships, and really, hopefully, over the course of today, we're going to be building up a better understanding of who the types of actors and people are involved in the policy-making process, and the ways in which you might want to engage with them, hopefully, so that you can find the right people, and then engage with them in a way that is going to be effective and hopefully persuasive. So it's all about humanizing the policy process. So we've split today into 3 kind of big chunks. So we're going to start off with thinking about what is policy, what's the policy process, what's involved. After lunch, then we're going to start thinking about who are the people involved and who are the people you might encounter as you begin your engagement process. And then the final area is going to be thinking about how do you do it. So we're going to be quite practical and sort of there's going to be lots of activities to help you think about, in a real sense, kind of what are the next steps and how would you actually go about this in practice. Okay. So I'm going to move on to the first section, what is public policy? Which is a kind of weird question, but I don't know, would anyone like to share what they think of as public policy? What is it? What does it mean? It's one of those terms that kind of gets bandied around, but is rarely defined. Does anyone like to share their thoughts on this? Okay, Hannah, do you want to? You look like you. No? So I mean, obviously there are sort of various people who have tried to define it in different ways, and I've included some in the handout, which I think Hannah has shared a link to or emailed round. So if you want to kind of read those afterwards, do feel free. The one I like is just very simply, it's everything that a government does and doesn't do. So the things that they decide to do, as you were saying, in terms of the decisions that they make and the way that they run the country, but also it's also important to think about the things that they decide not to do, because that can have an impact too. So just to run through this very quickly, and I'm sure this will be familiar to lots of people in the room, but it's just helpful to think about the sort of different branches of government. So, many countries, you will see these 3 branches. So you have the legislature, which are the people who make the laws. So in the UK, that's Parliament, so the House of Commons and the House of Lords. At the other end, you have the judiciary, so they're the people who are charged with judging people who are thought to have broken those laws. And then in the middle, you have the executive, who basically are in charge of running things. So they have to implement the laws and run things on a day-to-day basis. And so in the UK, that is the government, so the ministers, secretaries of state, who are supported by the civil service. And I don't want to get sort of bogged down in too much detail, but in the UK, our executive is drawn from the legislature, so the members of government are also usually members of the House of Commons, sometimes also the House of Lords. So there's a bit of, there are some people who will kind of fall into both of these categories in the UK. If you want more information on that, again, there is more in the handouts. You can come talk to me, or I think any of the speakers as well, over lunch, if you'd like more detail on that. But I think sort of bearing in mind those three different parts is quite helpful. So the next thing to mention up front is thinking about how evidence is used in the policy-making process. And I've taken this diagram from the UK Civil Service kind of handbook and how they think about it. And it's really just to say that policy-making, of course, evidence is a big part of that picture, but it's really important to remember it's not the only factor that ministers are going to be considering when they're coming up with new policies. So they're also going to be focused on the politics. And ultimately, most politicians, the bottom line is, am I going to get re-elected? So they're always going to be thinking about what are my constituents going to be thinking about this new idea? Are they going to vote for me again next time round? And the other part of the picture is thinking about implementation. And there's lots of examples probably that we all know of where a policy has seemed like a good idea in theory, but then actually has run into problems once it's been sort of practical problems on the ground once it's tried to be delivered. So if you're a policymaker, you're going to be trying to look for that sweet spot in the middle that hits all three of those. So you've got something that is supported by the evidence, that is going to be politically acceptable, and you're not going to have rioting in the streets because you've done something hugely unpopular, and is going to be practically possible to deliver. And I think, again, it's sometimes really useful just to bear this in mind if you're engaging with policymakers, because I think, obviously, as researchers, we're very much focused on the evidence. And if you're not conscious of those other things, you might kind of run into difficulties if you're proposing something that isn't going to hit those other two areas. And so it's not to say that we have to have answers on those, but being conscious of them is really helpful. Okay, and so I wanted to introduce this concept, and this is my last kind of theory slide, which has been called the policy funnel. And you may have also come across the policy cycle, which is sort of another way of showing the same thing, and which is also in the handout. But I find this quite a useful way of thinking about the policy process and the different stages and what it means for you if you're engaging with policy. So just to kind of run through the different parts of the process. So starting at this end, we've got sort of general opinion, which is what you might think of as the stage where an issue is starting to bubble around and people are talking about it. Maybe it's in the media. Maybe people are sort of starting to have conversations down the pub about a problem that is kind of arising. It then sort of gets picked up at the kind of political level, perhaps. And so you start having this public debate, and that's when you might see more of it on television, and you might see sort of policymakers or kind of influential figures starting to talk about this issue. And basically saying, okay, we need to do something about this. And so once it's got to that point where people are saying, okay, yes, something must be done, we start moving into this policy process, which is much more focused on, okay, so what do we actually do about it? So coming up with ideas for solutions or activities that are going to tackle and address this problem. And so at this stage, you might have people in the civil service kind of being tasked with, can you go away, come up with some options for me? The minister might say, can you come up with some options? What should we do to tackle this problem? And at that stage, there'll be lots of consultation, perhaps, and there'll be lots of different ideas coming from different people as to what we might do about the problem. As it moves along, then, to the final decision making. So at this stage, this is where we've narrowed it down from a range of different options to talking about, okay, this is the solution that we're going to pursue. And at this stage is when you might see something happening in Parliament. So maybe there's some new legislation that happens. So a bill might come forward that goes through Parliament, or there's a decision about funding. So maybe there's something in the budget that we're going to spend more money on X to solve the problem. And then it moves, once that's gone through Parliament, then you get the implementation phase. So it gets put into practice. And beyond that, sort of monitoring and evaluation. So has it actually delivered on what was intended at the outset? And the reason I quite like this way of thinking about it is that the sort of funnel shape gives you a bit of a sense of kind of how much room for manoeuvre there is. So if you're sitting on the outside trying to influence this process. If you're thinking about an issue that is more at this end, there's lots of scope because people haven't yet started thinking about what the actual specific solutions might be that we're going to take. So there's lots of opportunity to kind of try different ideas out and to put your views forward. But as it moves to this point where it's narrowing, there's much less room because once you've got to the point where legislation's involved, it's very detailed, and getting a significant change to that once it's kind of been introduced into Parliament is really difficult and probably impossible almost. So you might get a change in a word here or there, but you wouldn't get a completely new direction at that stage. And then obviously once you get kind of beyond that to the monitoring and evaluation, then it sort of opens up again, and there is potentially scope to almost go round again. So I find this quite helpful when I'm at the start of a project, thinking about, okay, this is the issue that I'm working on. Where does it fit in this process, and where should I be focusing my efforts? Because if it's something that's more at the general opinion end, I might want to engage with a much broader range of stakeholders. So not just the politicians, but maybe some of the other opinion shapers in the sector. But if you're getting to the point where there's a bill, I'm going to be very focused on just who are the politicians who are involved in getting that bill through Parliament. Okay, so then sort of coming into the solutions and problems zone, the sorts of evidence that policymakers will be looking for is sort of, okay, have any of these ideas been tried before? So a historian at the back might be able to help with that. Or what have other countries done? Have they had ideas that have worked in this area that we could perhaps replicate? So value for money is obviously also going to always be very important. So thinking about what are the costs and benefits of the different options. And I guess evidence, the way that evidence might be used there is perhaps in building some of the models that are used to make those calculations. And at monitoring and evaluation, the basic question, has the policy actually worked? Has it delivered on what we wanted it to do in the first place? Sorry, they've gone back to front for some reason. And then on implementation, sort of thinking about what's the appropriate method. And that might be actually, so coming back to the point about people and humans, human-centered policy design, that will be a very important factor in thinking about the implementation. It probably never follows this pattern, and it will be different for different things. And some things happen very quickly. So I guess an example at the moment is around some of the legislation that's being brought in the UK around releasing perpetrators of terrorism crime. That's happened very quickly in response to a kind of crisis that's happened. Whereas there are other things that won't have that kind of time pressure and will take a longer time. There's things happen like general elections. You have something that was part way through this process, and then there's an election, and then it's got to go back to the beginning and start again. So there's, it almost never follows this nice, neat pathway. But I think as a sort of general model, it's still quite helpful to give you a guide, I suppose, or at least a starting point of how to think about it. Okay, so we're just going to talk about touch points, and by touch points we mean any time or kind of process where you as a researcher engage with a policymaker. So we've got some pictures on the screen, but would anyone like to suggest an example of what a kind of touch point or an engagement might look like? One that they've done perhaps in the past. Okay, so the one that I would add, and I will say this because I used to work in Parliament, so this is what I used to do for a living, but the other area you can get involved is with scrutiny. So I used to work for a select committee in Parliament, and their job is to scrutinise the government and the work that they're doing on policy, and they will run inquiries. So in the same way you can respond to a government consultation, you can respond to a parliamentary scrutiny inquiry, and you can send in written evidence. You might get called to give oral evidence as well. to one of those. But I think you covered everything else on my list. I do have some examples, if people are interested, of sort of policy documents that we've sort of collected from various places as examples of things that people have written, some consultation documents. Are people sort of familiar with those, or shall I sort of pass them round to have a look? Is it useful?